So in this video, I'm going to show how the benefit cost ratio of doing R&D is just a simple ratio of some of these variables, Y, which is GDP per capita this year, G, which is the growth rate of GDP per capita as long as you do R&D. The cost of doing R&D is expressed by S, which is the share of GDP you devote to doing research, and R, the interest rate. And this video doesn't use any advanced math. It's a little bit long. There's a lot of algebra, but anyone should be able to follow along if they are comfortable with doing a bit of algebra and trust me a little bit on how to handle infinities. So to begin, the main idea for how we're going to calculate this is we're going to imagine that we are thinking about taking a break from doing R&D for 1 year. If we don't do any R&D for a year, we save a little bit of our revenue that we would have devoted to research, and instead we can do other stuff with it. On the other hand, we give up a little bit of growth when we don't do R&D. So we're basically going to compare the benefits due to extra growth to the costs savings, or the cost of doing a little bit more R&D, to calculate this benefit cost ratio. Let's begin by thinking about the time path of GDP per capita under different scenarios. So if we choose to do R&D in every year, it's just sort of the status quo. In the first year, we get Y, which is GDP per capita. In the second year, that Y grows a little bit because we did R&D. It grows by G%, so we end up with 1 plus G. That is, if we grow at 3% every year, GDP goes up by 1.03 in the second year. Now, if we want to express all this in terms of the value to us today when deciding whether to do R&D, we actually have to discount this value by the interest rate. Okay, that's a sort of standard economics thing, but the general idea is that, if I have like $100 today and I can invest it at, say, 5%, then that's worth $105 tomorrow. And equivalently, if I can get $105, not tomorrow, in a year, that's worth $100 to me today because I could take the $100 invested at 5% and have the same thing in a year. So we divide by the interest rate to bring future value to present value. In the third year, we're going to have what we had the previous year, but it's going to grow again. So we square the growth rate. And if we want to bring that value to the present, we got to square that, and so on and so forth all the way out into infinity. It never really ends as far as we can tell. Okay. All right, so what's the present value of this? What's the value of this whole stream of income? Let's label that capital V. All right, and we can do a little trick to calculate explicitly what V is in a closed form solution, so a simple fraction. What we're going to do is we're going to factor out one of these terms from each of these terms here, okay? So we have still Y in the first year, but we're going to factor out 1 plus G over 1 plus R from the second year. And let's put this all in parentheses. So now we have Y. If we multiply this through, we're going to get back to that, okay? And then for the third year, since we've factored out one of these 1 plus G over 1 plus R's, we don't need two of them. So we have 1 plus G over 1 plus R. And then so on in the third year, okay? We don't need 3, we just need 2 because we factored 1 out, okay? And if we wanted to, we could write another third one just for fun. But the thing that you notice here is that this term in parentheses is the exact same as this term that I wrote before, this sum, okay? And that's one of the tricks with infinities. And that means that since we're going to call this sum V, we can just call this thing in parentheses V also. So V is equal to this year's GDP per capita plus 1 plus G divided by 1 plus R times V again, okay? And now we can solve for V, okay? We have a nice simple equation with V on both sides, so we can just subtract the term 1 plus G over 1 plus R times V from both sides and get this. And then we can simplify this term using, fractions. We factor out the V and we have 1 plus R minus 1 plus G all over 1 plus R. That's still equal to Y. And we've got sort of one of our first important results, which is that V times R minus G over 1 plus R is equal to Y. And we can just multiply and divide both sides of this by the reciprocal basically, and we get V is equal to 1 plus R over R minus G times Y. Okay, so the entire future stream of revenue can be expressed in this compact way as just 1 plus R, the interest rate, divided by R minus G times this year's GDP per capita. Tidy up the board and let's go again. Now suppose instead of doing what we just did, we take a year off of doing R&D. We can calculate how that's going to affect the growth rate of GDP as follows. Okay, so this year nothing happens, but next year we don't grow. And that's pretty much the only difference. We're still discounting the same. The only thing that's happening is we turned off growth for a year. In the second year, we don't catch up though, all right? We only grow once because we're growing from the previous level. We're starting R&D again, and that's how it was. The next year, instead of growing 3 times, we grow 2 times. And you can see how this spills over into the future. Every year, we're a little bit smaller than we would have done if we hadn't taken that year off. So we have to figure out what the value of that is. All right, if we go down to the next stage, down here, we can rewrite this value of skipping in kind of a convenient way. If we factor out 1 plus R, and just again scratch out one of these 1 plus G's, it's just another way of writing this whole summation up here, okay? Notice they're the same because if you multiply Y by 1 over 1 plus R, you get this term back and so on all the way through. But as we've discussed, everything inside here we haven't touched yet, and previously we said that was equal to V, okay? So we've shown that you can write the value of skipping a year as equal to Y plus 1 divided by 1 plus R times V, which is the future value of GDP if you don't skip. And up here, we expressed Y also in terms of V, so we can also write this as R minus G divided by 1 plus R times V plus 1 over 1 plus R times V. Okay? All right, now let's go further and calculate basically the benefits of doing R&D for 1 year is going to be the difference between the value of doing R&D minus the value of skipping, okay? And the value of skipping we've got right here. So we can rewrite this as this minus this, all right? And to solve this, we basically need to multiply and divide this guy by 1 plus R and 1 plus R, which is equal to 1. And we can basically see that this is all going to simplify a lot. Okay. I lost my cursor. There it is. All right. So 1 divided by 1 plus R times V minus 1 divided by 1 plus R times V. We can scratch out this 1 and scratch out this whole term. And we have a minus R or a plus R times V divided by 1 plus R over V minus an R times 1 plus R over V. Then we have a minus times a minus, so that's a positive. The whole thing washes out to just G over 1 plus R times V. That's the benefit of doing an extra year of R&D. Now we need to figure out the cost. Once again, before we go on, let's tidy up the board. Okay, voila. So let's now turn to the cost side of the equation. And let's begin again by thinking about what's our cost going to be under the sort of status quo. Well, we're going to spend share S of our income doing R&D this year, and next year, and the year after that, and the year after that, on and on and on, okay? Well, we can just factor out this S, and we're left back where we started, so we just have S times V, all right? So our status quo cost is just S times V. Let's tidy up again. Okay, and the last thing we really need to do is figure out what's the value of the cost if we skip a year, okay? So we have to do 2 things if we're going to do this. First off, if we skip a year of R&D, we don't have any cost the first year, so this becomes 0. The second year, we go back to spending R&D, and we spend some share of our income, but because we skipped a year, we also don't grow that year, okay? And then the next year, we're back to saving some constant share S to do R&D, and we grow 1 time, and then the third year we're investing share S, but we don't grow 3 times, we grow 2 times, and so on and on. So just as before, we can rearrange this equation and get something down here that is in terms of this v variable. So we don't have to pull out a 1 plus g because that's in there. If we pull out the 1 plus r, and now we need to also add this s, and we need to change this to a 0. Okay, so we've got s times divided by 1 plus r times y. That gets us back to here. If we do these terms multiplied by this, we get back to this guy here, and so on. Okay, and we can rewrite this as follows. There's a little I in the word skip. Okay, so we have s divided by 1 plus r, and as we've discussed before, everything inside here is just v, the value of, the status quo time path of GDP per capita. Okay, so the value of skipping a year, the costs are s divided by 1 plus r times v. Okay, and so we can, as before, think about the total cost of doing an extra year of R&D relative to not doing it is normally we spend SV, and if we don't do it, we spend S over 1 plus R times V. Okay, and that is equal to S times V times 1 minus 1 over 1 plus R, and that is equal to S times V times R over 1 plus R. If you multiply and divide this by 1 plus r and you subtract 1, you lose the 1 in 1 plus r and you're left with just the r. Okay? All right. So this is our cost, and we've also got our benefit. And so the ratio of these two is the value of R&D. Or I guess I should say the benefit cost ratio of R&D. All right, let's tidy up one last time. Voila. And at last we can see that the ratio of benefits to cost of R&D can be expressed as G over 1 plus R times V over S times R over 1 plus R times V. And that's sort of just rearranging where I put the terms there. And you can see here that lots of things just drop out. The V's cancel, and the 1 plus R, the 1 over 1 plus R cancel, and so we're just left with G over S R. Okay. All right. And this is the key insight of this Jones and Summers paper, that the benefit cost ratio of R&D is a very simple function of three variables: the growth rate of GDP per capita, the amount of savings and resources devoted to R&D, or, equivalently, the amount that you have to spend each year to reap growth, and R, the interest rate. So if we plug in a couple simple variables, we can get an estimate of the benefit cost ratio, and basically the conclusion is any sensible values of these is going to give you a big number.